Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're so excited to have you here today and welcome you to our first webinar of the ACS National Breast Cancer Roundtable for 2025. And very happy to have you here and talking about a topic that has been of great interest to many of our members and organizations with whom we've partnered, and talking about solutions for success, enhancing patient access and accrual in cancer clinical trials. My name is Dr. Melissa Thomas, and I serve as Strategic Director for the ACS National Breast Cancer Roundtable, and excited to have you here today to learn more about this particular topic with Dr. Mark Fleury. I'd also like to acknowledge our program manager of the ACS National Breast Cancer Roundtable, Lily Meyer, who is working behind the scenes to make this program flow so effortlessly today. So she is definitely here working in spirit behind this, but for those of you who know her, she is excited to be here today and also share in facilitating and moderating this event. So we want to start out today again and welcoming all of you to this particular webinar series. And we're going to have an opportunity to hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. Mark Fleury. And we have an opportunity for some Q&A from our audience members. And again, thanks to those of you who in advance had shared so many interesting comments, topics, questions regarding the issue of clinical trials that we received prior to you joining us today. In light of that, we are offering an opportunity today for an interactive breakout session, which will give a chance, although for a smaller time period, but give a chance to be able to connect with those of you with similar backgrounds of organizational size and agency to be able to talk a little bit more detail about some of the topics that we're discussing today. And we'll wrap up with our closing remarks and next steps. Before we get started, we'd really like to acknowledge our sponsors who are listed on the slide here today, and we're so grateful for their continued support. We have many of our sponsor organizations and representatives joining us today on this call. So thank you for the support you've given to the ACS National Breast Cancer Roundtable, and excited to have you here today and share your expertise as well for all the work we're doing with this roundtable. So just a few ground rules. We share this before all of our webinar series, but we'd like to know you're here with us today. I'm seeing the participant list continue to grow, but given the size, unfortunately not able to do all introductions for this entire group. But we're just asking if you would type your full name and your organization and the role that you play in our chat box so we can keep track of that. And we're hoping that you will, though, use the Zoom tools to interact with us. So even though you're muted at this point and video off during the presentation part, we know that we hope that you'll use buttons, be able to share anything that you want to react. We welcome your comments in the chat section, and feel free to use that chat section to submit questions as well. We know that this is a busy time, so we ask if you would just please put those phones on silent for the time being for this particular webinar series, and we appreciate your full attention to this discussion topic today. This makes sense, but we always say we asked again to keep confidentiality at the forefront of all the work that we do, and we want to respect each other's privacy throughout this webinar series. And again, any questions about Zoom's privacy policies, we've got a link there that you can check that as well. So it is a distinct pleasure and honor to introduce to you today Dr. Mark Fleury, who has been an integral part of the ACS National Breast Cancer Roundtable and providing his support and expertise throughout even the short tenure that Lily and I have been part of the roundtable. And Dr. Mark Fleury is policy principal for the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, or ACS CAN, where he has worked since 2013. He specializes in research, drug development, and regulatory policies, along with other science and technology-related projects. He's worked on reform of diagnostic testing oversight, drug shortages. He helped lead a coalition in 2016 that authored a landscape report on drug development challenges in pediatric cancer, led another coalition in 2017 that created a report and recommendations focused on overcoming cancer clinical trial enrollment barriers. He's currently the principal investigator on a clinical trial testing the effectiveness of a new clinical trial screening tool. Throughout his work, Mark has striven to incorporate patient perspectives into inherently science-based issues, advocating for the inclusions of patients as partners throughout the bench to bedside translation of science. He holds a PhD in bioengineering from Switzerland, conducted postdoctoral research at MIT, and has previous policy experience, including time as a staffer to a U.S. Senator. It's our pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Mark Fleury. Thank you, Mark, for being here today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thomas, for the invitation to be here and for that introduction. Really excited about this topic today. As was mentioned in my intro, this is an area that I've worked on for the last number of years and very passionate about it. So I want to spend a little bit of time sharing with you what we've learned about some of the barriers patients face to enroll in clinical trials, and importantly, maybe what some of the things are we can do about them. So, here at the American Cancer Society, we have three major pillars which we do our work through, and that's patient support, advocacy, which is sort of where I'm housed at ACS CAN, and discovery. And in all of these pillars, we do things to help patients overcome barriers to enroll in cancer clinical trials. But critical to addressing barriers is to really understand what they are. And Einstein was attributed, probably didn't really say this, but he said, if I had 1 hour to solve a problem that my life depended on, I would study the problem for 55 minutes and then only try and solve it for the last five. So I think it's really important that we understand the problem before we jump too quickly into trying to solve things. So when we talk about clinical trial participation, I want to stress that it is not a singular event. It is a process with multiple steps. And each one of these steps has to be successful for a patient to ultimately enroll in a clinical trial. And first of all, there has to be clinical trials that match the patient's clinical characteristics. So obviously, if you're a breast cancer patient, you can't enroll in a prostate cancer clinical trial or vice versa. But even within those trials, there are a lot of specifications. And so first of all, you have to have a trial for which you're eligible, and that's not necessarily a given. Now, it doesn't do any good to have a clinical trial for which you're eligible if nobody ever goes through the effort to actually determine that eligibility. So is the patient pre-screened for trial eligibility? Now, assuming that that happens, the patient still has to be offered an invitation to enroll. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, that doesn't always happen. And then the last, but certainly not the least important, is does the patient consent to participate? Do they say yes? So often, we hear, we've done research, we show that 7% of cancer patients in the United States enroll on therapeutic clinical trials for cancer. And so some people will say, well, why aren't those other 93%? Why do they say no? Well, it's not that 93% say no. Many are just never given the opportunity to say yes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, each of these steps has to happen. This report was again mentioned in my intro. We published it in 2018. So it's a few years old, but I'll say that most everything in it is still quite accurate. We spent about a year with a couple dozen of the most brilliant minds in this clinical trial space to really search the literature and understand where those barriers are. And so can still recommend this as reading, but I'm going to, in the next couple of slides, give you the Cliffs Notes of what we found. So importantly, as I mentioned, there are multiple steps to enroll in a clinical trial, and there's barriers along the way. So if we take the hypothetical case of 100 cancer patients who are diagnosed with cancer and they walk through the doors of some institution to treat their cancer, and we say at the end only 7% enroll in the clinical trial, well, where did the other 93% go? And this chart really lays it out. This is work based on work that Joe Unger did, and I've had the chance to collaborate with him on a number of research projects. But looking at a number of different published studies and screening logs that on average, 77% or over 3 out of 4 patients who walk through the door of an institution won't have an on-site clinical trial for which they would be eligible to enroll in. Now, this number obviously varies depending on the institution you go to. If you're at an academic medical center, this might be much smaller because they run more clinical trials. If you're at a community site, this could be actually much bigger and as big as 100% if you go to a site that offers no clinical trials. But on average, 3 out of 4 patients are not going to have an on-site clinical trial for which they can enroll. So that's the single largest barrier that we have. Now, underappreciated is that there are a significant number of patients who are theoretically eligible for clinical trial participation, but they're never asked to participate. And that can be either because they weren't actually screened for eligibility, or they were screened and found eligible but not offered an invitation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, where that can create a lot of biases potentially. When we actually get down to the point of eligible patients who've been offered a slot on a clinical trial, it turns out that more than half of patients will say yes. So 55% of all patients, oncology patients, offered a slot in a clinical trial will say yes. So fewer say no than say yes. But I will say that when we think about interventions, we spend an enormous amount of time on this 7% who say no. And I was classically trained as an engineer in my original training. And, I was taught to take a systems approach. And so I zoom out and look at this, there are 85% of patients who are prevented from participation through no fault of their own. It's structural and clinical barriers that they don't control. So one of the things, there's a couple of nuggets that I hope you walk away from this presentation with is one, don't forget the 85% of patients who are never invited to enroll in a clinical trial and the need to do something about that. And I'll talk a little bit about how we can do that. So let's start. I'm going to go through each of those slices and talk a little bit more in depth about what we know about that. So when we say that 77% don't have a clinical trial on site for which they can enroll, is that an issue that the trials don't exist or where they are open? As many of you know, any given clinical trial may be open at 3, 5, 10, 50, or even 300 sites across the United States. They're called multi-site clinical trials. But obviously, not every trial is open at every site. So that 77% is just asking the question, is there a trial at that location that's open for which a patient is eligible? And to understand a little bit of a context here, I want to talk about how clinical trial eligibility screening occurs in the United States. And we know this through surveys and research that we've done. Typically, if you're diagnosed with cancer and you enter an institution, whether that's MD Anderson, Sloan Kettering, or your local community cancer center, if that site has clinical trials open at that site, they will typically pre-screen you for trial eligibility, but only for the trials that they have open at their site. They won't screen you for trials that are open across the street, across the city, or across the state, or across the country. Obviously, if you're eligible, they'll offer you participation, but if not, standard of care. And if you are not offered a clinical trial and you're still interested, typically a patient finds themselves sort of outside of the institutional infrastructure with some sort of self-serve or a third-party matching service. So this could be clinicaltrials.gov, it could be breastcancertrials.org, Leal, Emerging Med. There's a bunch of third-party, Massive Bio, et cetera, third-party matching services that look in a site-agnostic way that will look anywhere in the country or around a specified zip code. So there's really two separate domains, but today, almost every site solely screens for on-site clinical trial. So again, is it an issue with trials or location? Nobody had ever really taken a look at what is the proportion of patients who are or would match to a clinical trial if site specificity was removed. So we did this. Working with UT Southwestern, we worked with 84 actual patient records. So these were archival records. We didn't work with the patients themselves. We had this all IRB approved. But we asked, using those patient records, would those patients be eligible for a clinical trial at UT Southwestern? Again, 7 different cancer types, a dozen each. Now, this is an academic medical center, so they have a lot of clinical trials, and almost 40% of the patients could have qualified for an on-site UT Southwestern trial. We then searched within a 20-mile radius of UT Southwestern, so basically the greater Dallas metro area, and said, does it really matter if we look at a wider area? Because this is an academic medical center. And it turns out it did. By looking within a 20-mile radius, we could match 75% of the patients to a clinical trial. So we almost doubled the proportion of patients that would match to a clinical trial, even when the baseline was an academic medical center. And you can imagine how much of a bigger improvement that would make if it was a community site. So the short answer here is that if you open your aperture and look beyond a single institution, you can match a lot more patients to clinical trials. Now we took some of those patients. We basically took, I think, 21 patients out of that group, and sort of virtually airdropped them in a couple dozen zip codes throughout the United States, ranging from urban to suburban to rural, and the exact same cohort of patients in densely populated areas at the right, almost 90% would pre-screen positive to as a match to a trial. Those exact same patients in a rural area, only about 5% of them would match to a clinical trial. Clearly, they match to a clinical trial, but they don't match to a regional clinical trial because, these trials are only offered in certain locations. So the takeaway of this slide is the same person, depending on where in the country they live, may not be offered a clinical trial simply because of where they live and a lack of regional clinical trials. But I want to take this one step further, and say that variation occurs not just across regions, but within a particular city. So this is a case where we took 20 breast cancer patients and we searched in the greater Atlanta area. And we found 38 clinical trials for this group of 20 women. And we said, where are those clinical trials open in Atlanta? And Emory, which is an NCI designated cancer center, had not quite 2/3 of them. So they didn't even have all the clinical trials that this group could have enrolled in, but they had about 2/3. And compare that with Grady, which is a safety net hospital that only had about 13% of those trials open. There is a five-fold difference in the number of open clinical trials for these patients between those two sites, right? So, and you don't have to go to the extreme of safety net to NCI designated. You look in the middle, and there's still sometimes a 2 or 3-fold difference in trial availability. So what this tells us is, so long as we only screen in a site-specific way, the door that you walk through has the biggest impact on whether or not you'll end up on a clinical trial. I'll say it again. The door that you walk through, which institution you pick, has the greatest impact on whether or not you'll enroll in a clinical trial. Okay, so just this last year, we wanted to understand enrollment nationwide. Is the first time in decades that anybody's looked comprehensively at what the average clinical trial participation rate is in the United States. Turns out it's about 7% of all oncology patients enroll in a therapeutic clinical trial in the United States. Now, that 7% number is an average, but if we drill in deeper and we break out the enrollment by type of institution, what you see here in this chart is that NCI designated cancer centers, the average is 21.6%. So over 1 in 5 patients at a cancer center will enroll in a clinical trial. Contrast that to a community cancer program, which is 4%. There is a 5-fold difference in enrollment between an NCI designated cancer center and a community site. Remember what we saw on the previous slide? 5-fold difference in trial availability between community and NCI designated cancer center. The difference here in enrollment is not because the patients are that much different. It's because of simple availability of clinical trials. So let me say that again. The door that you walk through has the biggest impact on whether you'll be offered a clinical trial. So before we talk a little bit about solutions, I want to share with you this slide, and this is not based on hard data. This is Mark Fleury's conceptual framework for thinking about solutions. So almost any human characteristic follows a bell curve, whether it's height, weight, intelligence, you name it. Bell curves typically characterize human populations. If I think about the x-axis here as motivation to be in a clinical trial, and you go to the very far right, I think all of you guys are advocates. You know these people. There are people out there who would go to the end of the earth to enroll in a clinical trial. And I've met some of these people and heard stories. They've moved to other countries. They've started their own companies. They've started their own clinical trials. There is a subset of people that would do anything, right, to get in a clinical trial. And you can put out a few tools out there on the internet, and if they can find them, they will, and they'll use them, right? But that's a small number. If you move a little bit further to the left, people are still motivated, and you have a group of people who would still go out on their own and find a clinical trial and enroll in them. If it isn't hard, they won't go to any extreme, but they will, put in some effort. So make sure that those tools and participation is not too hard. But then you get to the middle. Remember, we said that 55% of patients offered a trial will enroll. So we know that patients by and large are open to clinical trials. But there's this big middle who would enroll in a clinical trial if it was sort of presented to them on a platter. They didn't have to do any work, right? Their clinician gave it to them, said, here's a clinical trial. It was at the institution where they were being seen. They didn't have to travel across the city or state or anywhere else. So a lot of folks would be willing, to do it if it's not much extra effort. And the reason why I point out these three different groups is as we think about solutions, we need to be careful about not creating solutions that only work, say, for the pink slice here. We need to make solutions that work for everyone. And so just as an example, you think about the folks at Grady at the safety net hospital. By definition, they're lower income, have less resources. We can't expect those who aren't offered a trial at Grady to then go out on their own and use clinicaltrials.gov and find a clinical trial and call the site and ask them if there's an open slot and have their medical records transferred. It's not going to happen, right? So just bear that in mind when you think about solutions. Don't create solutions that require somebody to be extremely well-resourced and extremely motivated. Okay, so how do we increase clinical trial availability? So as I've, hopefully shown you, you have to remove the site-specific approach. If we only look at the site where you walk through the door, there's always going to be disparities and we're not going to move the needle. We need providers to start looking for their patients in a regional manner. The other thing that we can do is that we can promote decentralized trial. And the idea here is that you may be enrolled in a clinical trial 200 miles away, but you can maybe get much of your care either at home or at your local institution, and maybe just occasionally going to that central site, so that the idea of where a trial is open has much less relevance. But regardless, I think we still need to expand community capacity to conduct clinical trials, and it takes resources, and we need to find a way to provide funding and resources to those sites. And we also need to make it easier to run clinical trials, so that it doesn't take so many resources to do that. I want to talk just briefly about a few things that ACS is doing. So it used to be that ACS, if you called our 800 number and were interested in trials, they would help match you to a clinical trial. We stopped that service years ago, and we went for quite a few years without having such a service. I'm proud to announce that this quarter we are starting back up a clinical trial matching offering in a pilot phase in the Northeast part of the United States. That will be a sort of a soup to nuts. It starts off with health-related social needs screening. Do they need, help? It will check for eligibility, reach out to those sites, do navigation, provide lodging and transportation if needed. So that is launching Q1. And the idea here is, again, if you can screen people for, regional or national clinical trials, you get away from sort of being subject to where you're only looking at the trials on your own site. Another project that we're doing, and this particular pilot is specific to prostate cancer, but it has relevance in that the model, I think, can be used for any cancer or all cancers. And it's called Project Impact. And what we're doing is giving 5 sites out in the community $200,000 a year. Relative to a cancer center grant, this is peanuts. But for a small to medium-sized site, a couple $100,000 is enough to hire staff. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that we need to do to get community sites to run more trials is to give them resources. So this is giving 5 sites $200,000 a year. And the goal on this particular project is to try and get more African American men on clinical trials. But again, the model is extensible to other cancer types. Another thing that we're doing, and this is my particular project, is a project we refer to as a Blue Button. The idea here is that right now sites typically only screen for on-site clinical trials, and then you have to go to some other site to screen for regional trials. And what we've done is we created a tool that works within a provider's workflow so that they can simultaneously screen for their own clinical trials and those within a specified radius. And we have a pilot underway to test this at UT Southwestern, an NCI designated cancer center, as well as Tampa General Hospital, which is a safety net hospital in Florida. So the idea is we think that we can match more patients to trials, and stay tuned, we're underway. So now I want to switch over to this next tranche of barriers. So about 9% of patients we know are not asked to, who are nominally eligible to enroll in clinical trial, are simply not asked. And again, there are sort of two reasons why this occurs. One could be that they're not screened, as we'll talk about in a minute. Not all patients are screened for trial eligibility. And in other cases, they may be screened and found eligible, but for some reason, the provider makes the decision for the patient and says, I don't think they're going to want to enroll or they're not going to be compliant, and so I'm just not going to offer the trial. As I'll argue, I think multiple times in the next couple of minutes, I think both of those approaches introduce a lot of opportunity for bias in who gets offers for clinical trials. So why don't providers screen and refer? Well, we went right to providers and asked them. In 2019, in collaboration with ASCO and ACCC and ONS, we issued a survey. We got about 700 responses from every state except for Alaska, I think. And had surveys that oncologists, nurses, clinical trial coordinators answered. And I won't go through the whole thing, but I want a couple of high-level observations. When we asked the respondents, at your site, do you screen all patients for clinical trial eligibility? And about half did, which means half didn't. So at those sites that didn't screen everybody, there's a question of who gets screened and why, and are there people who are falling through the cracks, which you could find in a clinical trial if you just went through the effort of screening. Obviously, we're not at a place of universal screening. When we asked how do you do it, and again, this was in 2019, so things may have changed a little bit, but I don't think it's changed drastically. Right, it was very manual. Chart review was over 80%. Tumor boards, which is, a bunch of people sitting around in a room, discussing a case. When you look at like electronic tools built into EHRs, it was fewer than 20%. So not only is it, not consistent that everybody's screened, but the way people are being screened is a very manual process. Now, this next question, I regret we only asked of a subset of the people in the survey. I wish we would have asked everybody, but we asked the people who said, I don't screen patients for offsite trials and I don't refer to offsite trials. We asked them, what would it take for you to do that? And the top two answers were better, it really had to do with tech and tools. Give me something in my workflow that lets me know what's in the region. That's really what we tried to do with Blue Button, right? Is to do that. So we're testing that. A little bit lower down is navigation. They think that the patients need support, and so important to note that. The publicly available data on clinical trials is really bad. So we've also been trying to reform clinicaltrials.gov. And then lower below that is the business models. Why do it financially? But the silver lining here is when we asked for those respondents who said, we offer clinical trials, we said, why? Why do you do it? And the answer was, we think it's the best care. So it turns out that providers really want to do this. They think it's the right thing to do. They're not doing it for artificial reasons. And so those who aren't doing it probably just need those barriers removed or a little bit of a hand up to make it happen. So when we think about screening and inviting everyone to participate, we think that along with a site selection where a trial is opened is probably one of the likely sources of biases in clinical trial participation. We need the right tech and tools to do it, things like Blue Button and others, but you still need resources, navigators to help those patients get in those trials, better data, and the right business models. Okay, so now I want to jump down to sort of the people who say no. And again, we working with Joe Unger did some research on this, and we said, well, okay, you've made it through all those steps. There's a trial available. You've been screened. And you've been offered. Now, do people say yes? And the bottom line is that on average, 55% will say yes. Slight differences between academic sites and community sites. We don't know exactly why. I mean, you might posit that folks who go to the effort to go to an NCI designated cancer center might be open to more, more types of treatment, but it's not huge. It's not a five-fold difference here. By and large, roughly half the people will say yes to clinical trial participation. So one of the things that I think that this really showed, and I want to drive this home, is that patient refusal to enroll in a clinical trial is not the reason why we're, quote unquote, low enrollment. People are willing, they just have to be asked, okay? But this next piece, I think, is I really want to drill down on this as well. Many of the studies that we looked at had demographic information, and for those that did, when we looked at acceptance rates, we looked between Black, white, Hispanics, and Asians. And there was no difference in the acceptance rate to invitations to participate in oncology clinical trials. Again, we've heard time and time again that the reason why Group X is underrepresented in clinical trials is because they don't trust the system and they're always saying no to clinical trials. I want to be clear. Medical mistrust is real. It's well documented, and it is real. What we see from these findings is that in the case of oncology therapeutic treatment trials, it does not appear to play a role in who says yes and gets in a clinical trial. So, using the idea that the groups that are underrepresented, it's quote unquote their fault because they're not saying yes, we do not have data to support that. And we think that the disparities that we see in the back end of who's in clinical trials has more to do with offers and where trials are being opened. Okay, so when we think about why patients say no, there's really top four reasons that come out in surveys, and those are costs, and that can be medical costs, copays, coinsurance, deductibles, and then non-medicals, things like parking, transportation, food, lodging, etc. Now, this is one place where I will back up a little bit and say the one demographic group that says no to clinical trial participation more often than any other is if you're an individual that comes from a household that makes under $50,000 a year, you're about 30% less likely to say yes to a clinical trial. And it turns out that low-income folks are really sensitive to any perceived added cost, and they're more likely to say no to a clinical trial. And these are some of the costs that we're talking about. When we talk about logistics, it's the inconvenience of appointments. Sometimes trials take more times to come in, or if the center is further away. But when we step back and we think about that, these top two are really pragmatic barriers. So, the question is not, it's not that they don't want to enroll, it's they would enroll, but they're worried about it costing money, or they can't get childcare, they can't get to the trial. Whereas the bottom two, fear and a desire to retain control over care, are very much more philosophical. And again, this is another area where I often hear, calls to sort of re-educate people about, the importance of clinical trial. And I will say that you can I'll say, quote unquote, quite easily solve somebody's pragmatic barrier. You give them a gas card, pay for their lodging, arrange for childcare. That is a solvable problem. Changing people's philosophy is much tougher, right? We just came through an election where literally billions of dollars were spent trying to change people's minds or philosophies, to change a couple percentage of the people who believe one way or another. That money would be far better spent solving pragmatic issues like helping to pay for parking or childcare. But again, I want to stress that there is an upper limit. Even if we solve all the pragmatic issues, you give people two choices between Coke and Pepsi, Chevy and Ford, staying in or going out for date night. People are going to make different decisions, and we're already, roughly half or over half are saying yes. So the ability to move the dial here is not huge. So what I would encourage folks is to not spend money on, PSAs or Super Bowl ads or anything like that, but rather focus that money on solving people's really pragmatic issues. So again, it's the smallest contributor to low enrollment. We know it's relatively high. So, if we're looking to really move the needle in a big way, this is probably not it. Navigation can help with a lot of those pragmatic issues, helping connect them to the right resources. And we don't think that differential willingness to enroll in clinical trials is the driver of disparities. So we're coming to the close here. I'm coming up on my time here, but look at these four questions again. So are there matching clinical trials for patients? The answer is yes, but it's often not at the sites where the patients are being seen. So there's this disconnect. The trials are there, but not at the sites where they're being seen. So we need to promote regional screening and referral. We need to try and figure out ways to decentralize these trials. But we also need to invest in infrastructure in the community and make those trials simple so that community sites can run them. Is the patient pre-screened? Many are pre-screened, but not all. It's very inconsistent from site to site, and thus far still very manual. It's very site-specific, not regional. So we need to provide the right tools to do this in workflow that doesn't take a lot of extra effort, but we still need staff to do the work, and we need the right incentive structures. Are patients asked to enroll? We know that many aren't. Many eligible patients are never asked to enroll, and this is really low-hanging fruit and probably a big source of disparities. And again, to try and get that number up, we need the right tools and resources and incentives. And lastly, as we just talked about, do they consent to participate? For the most part, yes, they do. It's not the big driver of non-participation. The disparities that we see are socioeconomic rather than racial and ethnic. And we can focus on solving those pragmatic barriers. So, cost and ease and logistics. So last slide here, things that you can do depending on if you're a site or an advocacy organization. We need, there's a famous quote, right, that Wayne Gretzky made that said, you will miss every shot on goal that you don't take. So if you want to score more goals, you got to take more shots. And really, that's a takeaway for clinical trial participation. If you want more people in clinical trials, you have to ask more to enroll, right? And that has to be through additional staff, technology, and opening more trials. We need to get out of our siloed individual site mentality and make screening regional. We need to be able to provide navigation to hold the hand of the patients to get into those adjacent clinical trials, support patients financially and logistically with their needs. And this last one is very practical. I think I often hear people say, well, the reason at my site that people don't enroll is because, whatever, they don't trust the medical system or this, that, or another. And I'll ask, what's your acceptance rate? Is it 50%, 20%, 80%? And they're like, I don't know. And the way that we found, the research that I showed you was sites rigorously for whether it's, a week, a month, or a year, took every patient who walked through the door and said, is there a clinical trial for them? Are they screened? Were they offered? And did they say no? And if they said no, why? Was it mistrust? Was it they just didn't like the clinical trial, et cetera? So I would challenge any site that really wants to make a difference, because every site's going to be a little bit different what the major barriers are, but keep screening logs for some period of time. Then you can apply at your site or in your community what those specific barriers happen to be. So again, thank you for your patience. And with that, happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, Dr. Fleury, and sharing not only some really interesting data, but I might think turn the dial, I think, on what people's perceptions are about accessing and accruing clinical trials, especially with the research that you presented. I think it's also very inspiring to hear about some of the current projects undertaken by the American Cancer Society and noting the clinical trial matching offering. How exciting is that? And looking forward to hearing updates with the progress today, as well as project impact and opportunities to see how these specific tailored approaches to certain cancer sites can make an impact and hopefully increasing those trials, especially to minority and underrepresented communities. I know we offered an opportunity in the chat to share any questions that any of you might have, and I'm still looking at the chat as well as Lily's doing the same. And I also have a couple questions, if you don't mind, Mark, just to get the ball rolling, if that's okay.
By all means, yes.
Great. And I have lots of questions, but I know we have limited time and want to get to breakouts, but such interesting data. And I wanted to ask, I know that we saw in your research that that physicians often don't have time, right, even to screen and refer patients. And just wondering if you have any recommendations for incentives or workflow changes that could make it easier for providers to integrate that trial referrals into their practice.
Yeah, I think, and we're learning this firsthand in the Blue Button pilot. The Blue Button trial is actually a clinical trial in itself of trying to, test a new tool for trial screening. Those two sites are well behind their accrual for the project that we, contracted with them to do. And even though we've given them a tool that should ease the amount of work it is, they're still not accruing at pace. And even with the tool, it still takes staff and staff time, to push the button and talk to the patient and offer them the trial and things like that. So I think we can make the screening process less labor intensive, but it doesn't take it to zero. And if you find that clinical trial, you still need to answer the patient's questions and things like that. So really what we found is I think that sites, especially, so you think about like a NCI designated cancer center, a provider might have some percentage of their time set aside for clinical research, right? They're not having to produce RVUs for the whole time that, they're at work every day. And a community site doesn't have that luxury, right? And so it's finding those economic models whereby there are either wholly dedicated staff that's their only job, or creating set aside time for the providers who are split clinicians and researchers. And I think that's a tougher nut to crack because, anytime you got folks sort of doing it nights and weekends, so to speak, or between patients, it's always going to be the last thing that they get to. So make it easier. But I think that's something we're still trying to crack is, than how to create that time. And I think, finding folks who are not reimbursed at the same level as an oncologist, so getting lower level staff who can do that first line screening.
No, thank you for that. And we do have a couple questions here in the chat. I know Vanessa has asked that as a navigator, this might be hard to answer in just a few minutes, but it's a great question, Vanessa. But as a navigator, what education, if any, do you recommend sharing with patients up front before trials are even discussed or assessed with their providers?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important, while we know that clinical trial acceptance is relatively high, I think that doesn't come automatically. I think patients often have questions about clinical trial, and there are some conceptions that maybe are not correct. So I do think as a navigator, preparing folks from the very beginning, to think about clinical trials and to couch them in a way to make sure that folks don't think that they're a last resort, that they're designed to be ethically uh, such that whatever's being tested has just as good a chance of being successful as whatever the standard of care is. So I do think there are some just clinical trial 101 that can be introduced in a light way to patients, so that they have a little bit of a background and even a conceptual sense that their doctor might come to them with a clinical trial, so that that's not the first time they hear about it or start thinking about it. So I do think there is some contextual stuff. I wasn't involved with it, but I know that through our Lion program, for navigators, they have introduced some clinical trial training modules that I think are meant to do that, provide some materials for navigators to sort of prime or prep patients for clinical trials and answer some common questions about them.
Great, Mark. And I think that folks can be able to access that information, at least in some part online, right? Through ACS Lions, maybe.
Yeah, I'm aware of it. I wasn't involved with it, so I can't tell you the specifics of, is it already rolled out or is it about to be rolled out or what the questions are. I'm not the right person to ask, but I know it exists and they've developed some materials. So
Great, thank you for that. I know we're right on that edge of time. We were hoping to do breakouts, but I know there's a few questions in here. Thank you, Brittany. If we get a minute here at the end, we'll make sure we get back to that question. So we appreciate that. But in the essence of time, we're going to slip to the next set of slides so we can talk a little bit about an opportunity here for breakouts. And I know Dr. Fleury has graciously stated he can join us here throughout the rest of our time so that we can have an opportunity to engage a little bit more again with each other. So we're going to have a chance now with a little bit of time here, just about 10 minutes, to be able to join a breakout room. And so we want you to pick up the room that most closely matches your organization or one that sounds interesting to you. So we'll give you a little more details here in just a second. So once you jump into your breakout room, again, if you'll type in your name and organization so folks in your breakout can see who you are. And we just want you to take 10 minutes to get to know each other. We've got some guiding questions to give you so we can talk about some best practices and promising ideas. The advisory group for this particular project on our priority team with our ACS National Breast Cancer Roundtable Strategic Plan was very intentional with this webinar, as was Dr. Fleury, in making sure that we have a chance not only talk about those barriers, but look at some best promising practices and trying to address those. And so I think the next slide, Lily has shared, I think, those particular starting questions, and we'll make sure those are available to you. So this is what we're hoping in this very brief 10 minutes of some introductions, which we hope can continue the dialogue after today's meeting. But we want to talk about maybe just if you can share some promising practices and your own experiences about strategies, about partnership or collaborations that you specifically worked on with engaging underrepresented populations, or looking at what you've done to help overcome some of the barriers that you've experienced or we've learned today from Mark's extensive body of research that we can help learn as well. And I think the next slide, I think we're going to have a chance to join the breakout rooms right now. And the breakouts are kind of listed on size. So if you have a chance to join the breakout room, you can click on that box that's down there. It says join breakout room, and you can join either a smaller cancer center, an academic or large cancer center, advocacy groups, public health, or others. So again, click on the box that says join a breakout room and just click join, and we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Many of us have had to drop off for just a second, but in closing remarks, I know one of the great things about jumping out of those breakout rooms is hearing that so much talking, engagement, that you didn't have enough time, which is great. That means there's opportunities for continued conversations and collaborations after the conclusion of today's webinar. But I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to learn more truly about the evidence and science behind clinical trials participation, and opportunities to learn more about best practices and methods in which we can increase clinical trials access and participation for all. Thank you so much for your engagement. A special thanks to Dr. Mark Fleury for his research, his dedication, and opportunities to be able to learn more about this particular topic. A special thanks to our ACS National Breast Cancer Roundtable Steering Committee members and advisory group who helped in the planning of today's session. And also would like to seriously thank Lily Meyer, our program manager, for facilitating all of today's activities. I love hearing from you, Julia. Right, you needed more time. And let me tell you, if you need more time, let us know. If you'd like to learn more about the National Breast Cancer Roundtable here at the American Cancer Society, please just reach out to Lily or myself. We'd be happy to share more about the membership and opportunities to collaborate. If this is a topic that speaks to you, we have an amazing priority team that's dedicated specifically related to clinical trials. That group meets next week for the first time this year, and we'd be happy to have your involvement. So for those of you who want more time, want opportunities to connect, we have opportunities to do that here in the near future, not only as part of a committee group or committee work, but also in future programming and activities. So thank you all so much. We hope you continue to stay involved. Again, looking forward to collaborating with you in the near future. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.